Okay, I guess we're started. I just shared the stream link to my team, and we should be good. Cool. Well, good morning, everybody. Hope you're doing well. Shared it. Oh no, my camera's not working. I might have to start this again. What? Give me a second. Let me just see. How do I do things? Use USB camera. Oh, it's flashing in red. I might have to start this again. Give me a second. There we go. There we go. I think it's working now. Every day, man, technical difficulties. You would think that since I work with computers and since I've done video and streaming and audio and all that kind of stuff in the past, I would be good at this, but no, that's not the case. Yeah, so good morning, folks. Hope you're doing well. And if you're watching this stream after the fact, hope good afternoon, good evening, whenever it is you decide to watch this thing. So today, I am going to be going over or having a deep dive into portals, specifically React portals, and how we use them within HSDS, our component library. So portals, essentially how this works is you would use portals for things like dropdowns, popovers, tooltips, anything that you need to bring from somewhere arbitrarily deeply nested within the DOM tree right up to the body level. So if you had something that's a body, and then you had a div, and then you had 300 divs, which is nowadays not too uncommon, I suppose, and you had your tooltip here. This is your trigger, so here you say hover, and then you need it to render, that little tooltip UI. The best way to do it would be to pretend it's a span. The best way to do it would be to, instead of rendering it at this level, you would bring it over to the body level, ideally at the very bottom, something like this. Oh my god, how do I move this over? Okay, something like that. So therefore, it's no longer at that 300 nested div layer. And why you would do this is for the ability for basically so that any CSS you might have targeted throughout any of these div layers or any throughout any bit of your application doesn't interfere with how the UI works. And this is really important for UIs like tooltips, dropdowns, and popovers, and modals. Not so much modals, but the other three, is because they have to position themselves so in a way that's relative to the original trigger point, which typically involves position absolute and some top left calculations and overflow handling and things like that. So you don't want any CSS to kind of interfere with that, which is why you need to portal something from point A to B. And those things have to stay in sync because there may be some sort of mechanism, whether it's a click or hover off or anything like that, that closes the portal that then removes it from the DOM like so. So in React 16, they introduced portals officially into their API via ReactDOM. So you can create a portal like this where you specify the component that you would like to render and also the mounting point of where you want it to go. Very similar to how you would use ReactDOM render. But instead of doing it at the root level, you would do it at the component level. Excuse me, it's still early in the morning. So you would do it at the component level in some sort of render method like so, and you would mount it onto a new location. So as per the documentation, React Portal does not create a new div or document element for you. You have to provide it yourself. All right. So then for this example, you would create a DOM element or of some kind. You would mount it manually via this component did mount, and then you would render your modal component thing into that document element thing, and then there you have your portal, and then you have something else to kind of control the mechanism for it. So this is perfectly fine. I like that it's natively supported, but the downside is I mean, you have to have a lot of scaffolding or boilerplate to just get this thing working. Ideally, what I'd want is to have some sort of solution where I have a portal component, I put my thing inside the portal component, and this just magically brings it to the body level for me. And I don't need to think about mounting, unmounting, coordinating clicks and to do things with it or anything like that, managing state, any of that kind of stuff. If it renders, it portals. If it doesn't, it doesn't. That's how it should be. So in order for you to do this, you need to create some sort of wrapper component to handle that kind of management for you. And then you would leverage the default React 16 API to actually do the portaling for the DOM element from A to B. So inside of HSDS React, oh, by the way, so this whole thing with portaling is not new to React, or this kind of design pattern. It's not new to the React world. The first time I encountered it was probably Bootstrap 3. This is the first time I noticed it. They did it with their Tooltips and Popovers. And I think it was when I was working with some Ember stuff. This was still when I was doing design stuff, so I wasn't heavily doing front end. The front end engineers, they added portals for their tooltips, popovers, and dropdowns, and it was a very clever idea and it worked very well. So that was something I kind of like learned from and have adopted since. So inside of HSDS React, we do have a portal component. And for context, HSDS React was a project that I started, it was originally called Blue, over 1.5 years ago. This was before React 16 and React Create Portal became a thing. So we had to roll our own portal mechanism for that, moving from point A to point B for that to work. So I'm going to walk over how that whole thing works. And this is the thing that powers our dropdowns, our tooltips, our popovers, and our modals. All of them rely on portals. How do I zoom? There we go. Okay, so the main mechanisms. This portal within HSDS React is unique. There's no other portal that does what our portal does, in that our portals need to natively support iframe rendering out of the box. All of HSDS React has to support this because one of our products, Beacon 2, renders within an iframe. So the management and handling of this, like where I should mount in terms of what the document means, whether it's within window document or iframe document or whatever, they should be handled at the components, and then your application shouldn't have to worry about that stuff, because that stuff is nuts. Trying to figure that out is nuts. So the first thing that the portal component has to do is figure out what the document is. This get document from component, this is from React Utils. React Utils is another small library that I wrote that handles all React things at a low level, so you never have to think about them because it's lots to think about. So here is the code for, what was it? Get document from component. Here it is. Yes. So you can do that. You can get the document from the component in several ways. So I'm laughing because this is my own workaround for it. So you can do this trick where ReactDOM, find DOM node, and then you pass in a component of some kind. It could be this if you're doing within a class-based component, or if you happen to have access to like another component that renders, you can pass it in there. But the caveat of this is if you have this within a class-based component, so if you had like class or some component, so just call it some, sure, extend React component, and you had this thing here within one of the one of the life cycles. This only works if you have something returned from the render. If you render nothing, null, which is something that you might decide to do, ReactDOM can no longer find this because there's no document or there's no DOM element bound to your component. That doesn't get injected to the DOM, and then there's no DOM known to find. That's why that doesn't work. So for my solution within the React Utils library is to leverage the shape of where and how React decides to store the document within a component. So if you take a look at an instantiated React instance or component thing, if you do a console log or something like that, and you inspect the shape, if it's React 16, because they're now in the fiber architecture, you'll see, if you drill down enough, you'll see something that looks like this, where eventually it'll lead to the document, the actual document object, which is what you need. And I have level 1, level 2, level 3 checked just because I think there is a slight change between an earlier React 16 version and a later React 16 version, which is why I have those various checks. React 15 is a little bit more straightforward in that you have a React internal instance. This is before Fiber. You have a context, you have a document, and that's where your document is. And with this technique, you're able to get the document of a component, even though it doesn't render anything, even if it renders null, without having to rely on a third party or a dependency, which is ReactDOM. I mean, you'd have ReactDOM anyway, but this is like a nice little dependency-free, fast way of getting the document, which is nice. So yeah, so that's what this does. And if for whatever reason this can't find the document, we'll fall back to the window document because that's what you need. So step 1, getting the document and setting it in cache, which is what we need. Step 2, figuring out the mount selector. So if we jump back to the portals document, README, this is basically what the mount selector is. Knowing what DOM object, or sorry, which DOM node to inject the portal thing into. You have the document, sure, but you can't inject stuff into the document. You have to inject it into like the body at the very least. So we have to figure out what that is. So get mount selector. What does that do? All right. So with Portal, with how I built Portal, you are able to customize the render location of it. It doesn't always have to be document body. It could be a selector of some kind. Like, so if you specify the what did I call it? Render 2. Okay. Render 2. If you did like app or something like that, it would find a document. I keep saying document. The DOM node, a node that has an ID of app, and it'll render there, or it'll try to at least. So this is what this mechanism is. It'll try to find it. If it can, it'll do it. If not, it'll proceed to the next one. If your render 2 happens to be an object, so if you happen to be passing it a HTML element of some kind, a node, be it like a div or something like that, it'll render there instead. Otherwise, continue through the flow. There is also a subcomponent that it'll try to look for, and it'll try to render there. If not, the fallback will be to the document body, which is here. No, here, this document body. So there's a difference between this, there's a difference between this specific example without this document body and this document body. So in React, if you don't specify, or if you just say document body or document, it almost always assumes window document. Almost always, not all the time, but almost always. So if you do render within an iframe of some kind, typically regardless of how you instantiate your components within an iframe, because there are different iframe rendering libraries, there are different iframe components, you can even construct your own. When you have just document something, in those cases, it often refers to window document, not the target document of the iframe that you're referring to, which is wildly unpredictable, especially if you want your components to always work with iframes or non-iframes out of the box. You need something super predictable, which is why in the very beginning, we cached and tried to figure out what document was, so that when we figure out the mount selector, we reliably, 99.99% of the time, know that it's a document and we can get the body for it. Great. So the reason why this is a set state is in the very beginning, we don't render anything. Just because the component is not ready yet. We need to figure out what the document is and the correct mount selector before we can open up the portal. So it goes through 2 render cycles. One is the preparation step, and the second one, after the set state, is when the portal is opened. Great, let's open up the portal. Open portal, what does this do? All right, so way back, we added this on before open callback, which is handy. But if I were to rewrite this again, this would actually be a promise. Before then, it was just a function that the user had to resolve if they decide to use it. It's fine. It's just the API could have been cleaner. So that's all this is. If you decide to use on before open, then it'll fire it, and then you have to fire the callback in order to actually mount the portal. So let's pretend we didn't do this, and internally we'll set a, I don't want to call this state, instance variable, sure. So we'll set the instance variable of isOpening. And this is a very handy trick if you're doing things within a React component lifecycle that you don't want to involve set state. Because anytime you do a set state, the component re-renders. And therefore, subsequent children components re-render potentially. So as a performance thing, just set an instance variable like this, and your component won't re-render, and your component will be able to keep track of state internally. Depending on how you feel from a functional standpoint and all that kind of stuff, especially with the new hooks API, this might not be a good way to go. Again, it's up to you. I like it because all this stuff is managed and contained within your component anyway, and it's performant. So that's why I like it. That's why I do it. So now we'll mount the portal. Mounting the portal. Okay, so it gets the props from the whatever it is you defined the portal, and it gets the state. And why is it doing this instead of doing this dot props? Give me a second. Okay. Got it. All right. So the reason why it does this is because there is a chance that props will be different when you do the open portal mechanism. So here, there is some sort of logic that, yeah, there's some sort of logic that intercepts the will receive thing in order to recalculate the open of the portal. Looking at this, it's not that great. I probably would refactor this a little bit to make it a little bit clearer and more robust, but overall it's fine right now. So let's just ignore that. So props is, for the most part, typically props, because I think for our implementation, we probably don't. Oh, yes we do. Yes we do. All right. So the reason why, this is just coming back to me. So the reason why this mount portal mechanism requires you to get props is because you are able to control the opening and the closing of portal manually if you wanted to via this in. So this is a Boolean that could be true or false. And if this changes, it needs to trigger one of the life cycles in order for that open portal mechanism to happen again. So that's why the open portal is tapped into component will receive props. And that's why the props is dynamic, because it could be next props, the one that's receiving, or the one previously, which is currently bound to the component. So that needs to be dynamic. That's why this method exists the way it does. Okay, now we know. So if there is no mount selector, we have to kill this one because it won't work if there's no mount selector. This one is if their node is if there's okay here we go. This guy. So this is very, very similar, or it's identical to this implementation here, where when you mount your, I guess in this case, modal component, it'll automatically create, or sorry, when you construct the modal component, it'll create the div, and then the div will mount to the DOM at this point. But some div has to be created in the first place, and that's what this does. So this is just a guard where if the node has already been created, then we'll just render the portal content. Otherwise, we will create the node the first time, we'll adjust the class name, we'll adjust the ID, and we'll mount the node into the mount selector. By default, that's document body, and then we'll render the portal contents. And then we'll set some internal state or internal instance variables to certain flags, and we'll fire a callback if it's defined. So this is how we'll fire the onOpen callback, and in the inverse, for the unmount, there is an onClose callback that we'll fire. So now we'll do the render portal contents method. At this, sorry, I bit my tongue. So at this point, we know what the correct document is. We would have created a root document element to mount to. In this case, we'll create a div, and then we'll mount this div into the document body. So now we have our component that needs to be injected into the actual DOM. Right now, it's just floating in memory somewhere. All right. So this prop provider thing, this is an internal thing within HSDS React. It's a provider that allows for props to be defined and passed around at a context level, which is really great. So, I mean, this is unique to HSDS React. This could not be here, which is how it was before, and it would still work just fine. This is the most important part. ReactDOM, unstable render subtree into container. So, I mean, you look at the name, it looks pretty dangerous already. That's because you're not really supposed to do this. You're supposed to use ReactDOM render and not this. So previously to ReactDOM create portal, this was how people did things. You had to use this very specific API to manually render your component into a specified node. And that's how you were able to do portaling. And that's how this works. So at this point, I would have cached the portal of whatever this returned after injecting the portal contents, which is children, which is what happens if you did this. Hello, into your portal. So at this point, this div with the hello, that's what this is, that's being injected into the node, which has already been injected into the document body. And that's how a portal renders. And the inverse of that, the teardown, is actually way simpler. So to unmount the portal, we have to first check if this node exists. If it doesn't, that means the portal is already unmounted. Okay. So we'll proceed through. We'll pluck the onClose callback from the props. We will unmount the component at this very specific node, and we will, after the component. So here there's various parts. There is the document body. There is the div, which is the mount selector, I believe that's what I called it, and there is your component. Okay. So this teardown process, first we have to remove your component from the div selector, which we are here. Then we have to, oh no, sorry, this is not a mount selector. This is the node, and then this one is the mount selector. Okay. So after we remove your component from the node, we'll then delete the node from the mount selector, like so. We'll fire the onClose callback, and for our internal properties, variables, instance variables, state things, we'll reset everything again. And that's the entire process. Pretty intense, I think, for trying to render a thing within within the DOM, but that's how it works. It's basically a three-step process to figure out the original mount selector, falls back to your document body, and again, this could be a window or a random iframe. It doesn't know. It'll find the correct document body to do that. It'll create and inject this div node, and lastly, it will render the specified child in here. anytime there's so anytime we have to use the word child or children inside of a JavaScript context, I always find it very, very humorous because it's so dumb. Render your children, and like if you in cases where you only have like only child or things like that, it's just very silly. So uh, I'm just gonna change this just for funsies. So render your child. And the inverse of that is basically to remove this, and to reset everything. And that's how portaling works. And with that, we are able to power modals, dropdowns, tooltips, popovers, and anything that you can think of and dream of portaling. And that's it. This is the entire mechanism responsible for rendering your whatever you've specified into the by default document body level. The thing that binds this portal mechanism with, I guess, the mechanism that you would use to trigger whether this renders or not. So for example, let me just pull up a component from HSDS React. Dropdowns. Dropdowns are intense, but we'll look at dropdowns. Dropdowns. So the thing that binds this particular dropdown with the trigger, that is handled by something else, typically the component itself, to know when to open and close and coordinate all that kind of stuff. So, I mean, I guess we still need to do this part, this parent part, where you handle the click and then you would then determine whether or not the modal renders or not, whatever. That's what the component does. So this would be tooltip, tooltip, drop down, modal, whatever. That's what this is. What we did was we created this part in a very intense, robust way. We made this part. That's what portal is, and the thing consuming the portal is responsible for rendering whatever UI that needs to be portaled. So if we inspect the element on this guy, we will see that many divs later, it has injected itself, this drop-down container, to the body level, even though the trigger is nested in an arbitrarily deep spot somewhere else in the DOM. So there's one thing that portaling gives you, besides like overriding CSS stuff and whatnot, that you cannot get if you didn't portal. And that is, let me see if I can pull it up for demonstration purposes. What did I call it? Auto dropdown? Yeah, within modal, sure. So this modal is portaled. And I also have a dropdown that's portaled. And typically when you have modals, you have some sort of overflow handling to ensure that if your modal grows to a specific size and it has a scroll bar and so on, that's great. But in that standard kind of implementation, you cannot do this. This is not something that's possible to do. Because if you have an overflow, then if you have a dropdown that drops down, the dropdown will get cut off, and now you can't see your dropdown within your modal. So having a dropdown within a modal, or a tooltip or a popover within a modal, that's not portaled, you will not be able to see it outside the box of the modal. So just based on that feature alone, and how common I guess it is to have tooltips and stuff within modals, it's probably a very good idea to look at portaling so that you can support this kind of user interface. The other ridiculous thing about portals that happens to involve dropdowns is the fact that you can do, I guess, more easily do nesting, drop-down nesting things that work like that, and so on. Yeah, portals helped with that as well. So there's a lot of things that portals help you with, and I think just have the fact that you're bringing it to the body level where the CSS is controlled. That is like the main thing. That's why you do this in the first place, and you would do this to enable certain interactions where you have popover dropdowns and tooltips within popovers dropdowns and tooltips. And yeah, this is Modals, everybody. Hopefully this was helpful. And if not, I apologize and hope you have a wonderful day. Take it easy. Bye.